Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Doctorpiece Theatre. My name is Dr. Dennis Business, and we are going to delve into Chapter 2 of Stones to Abbigale. It's a cursed little beast of a book, isn't it? I don't remember where we were at. I don't remember what James did. I know he's at high school. I know he met Abby. It's about all. His mom is mad. His sister's a whore. The teachers are stupid. And Dr. Business has had to shoot this fucking video 3 times. That's how my blunt turned into that. Because I kept having buffering problems. Can you see that in here? All right, into the book. Seriously, I had issues. Let's get into it. Chapter 2. The following morning, Mr. Hanson approached me in the hall before class started. "We're supposed to talk," he said in his usual stern voice. I responded, "I know, but what about?" He began gesturing with his hands, as he often did. I guess it was a habit. He developed it to trick people into believing he was saying something interesting. "You know you're a smart kid, but you keep showing up to my class late and it's becoming a problem," he said. Surprised he showed genuine interest. I replied with a smirk, "I'll do better in the future." He continued, "All right, well, I wanted to ask you about a teacher's assistant opportunity." I replied, "You don't have a teacher's assistant?" I watched a bead of sweat roll down his balding forehead as he responded, "The last TA moved. And yeah, you were not always on time, but you get your work done honestly and efficiently." I asked, "Okay, Mr. Hanson. Next semester?" He authoritatively replied, "No. You can just take an elective class, and I'll let your current teacher know that from now on you'll be working with me." I immediately thought of the possibility of losing art class and rejected the idea. My only elective is art class right now, and I don't want to give that up," I said. He took a step back, looking offended, and lost his temper. In a disgruntled tone, he said, "Art? Art class is a joke, James. Tell me one person you know who is making a living painting pictures." All the students in the hall stopped and looked towards the shouting. I looked at Mr. Hanson, unaffected, reminding him that I would not give it up. I wasn't about to sacrifice the only class I had with Abby for alone time with a sweaty, angered, history-prone history teacher. Mr. Hanson looked at everyone stopped in the hall and screamed, "Oh, ha, ha! Everyone have a look! Mr. Hanson, he's such a goof! Move along, kids!" Everyone just looked at him as he turned back at me, maintaining his clearly frustrated posture. He then waddled into a classroom to begin class. I reluctantly entered with the remaining students to sit at my desk, which was conveniently placed within broomstick range from Mr. Hanson's desk. After enduring another useless history lesson revolving around my home state of Washington, it was finally time for art class. I walked as fast as I could without looking too awkward, in my normal fashion, only to find Abby wasn't even in the room. I sat in my new seat and waited, only to see everyone but her fill the room. Mrs. Stanley closed the door to our class trailer and instructed us to begin dismembering the possessions we brought from home. I began cutting the bear with a scalpel. Miss Stanley provided me, but my muscles seemed to work on their own, as I found myself consumed with Abby again, her overwhelming presence on the edge of every fragment in my mind. Just a short while into art class, I found myself looking down at my bear, now cut into 6 pieces. I felt like I was in science lab dissecting an actual animal, the most noticeable difference being that the cotton stuffing didn't look like or stink of old flesh and death like real animals did. Later that day, during lunch, due to my mom not being able to afford buying me a cell phone, I used a payphone to call Abby, but got no answer. I didn't feel like eating, so the rest of lunch I just sat on a bench outside, staring at people interacting with each other. I made a major effort to distract myself, knowing that focus on what could be was mostly a waste, considering I was so powerless to influence any change at that point. Even just watching the bushes move around in the wind made more sense to me than letting worry consume me. Later that night, after I had just finished my shower, I placed the cordless phone we had in the house on my bed on the windowsill. I would have dialed her, but I didn't want to call more than once a day for fear of wearing out my welcome. That night, a few different calls came in, but they were always from my sister, Lisa. Her receiving a barrage of phone calls from random guys was nothing new to anyone in the house. The normal conversation you could expect to hear Lisa take part in, with excessive projection in her voice, would most always revolve around how stupid she thought the other girls at school were, and how she basically hates everything about Lakewood High. I didn't want to know what she was talking about, ever, but my TV volume couldn't compete with her voice. It was like she thought she was so important, everyone around her just had to hear everything she had to say, no matter how trivial the topic. After a couple hours, she finally stopped running her mouth, so I turned off my TV, and with it my room faded to darkness. I welcomed the silence like a warm blanket on a cold night. I woke up the next morning to see the phone sitting there just like my stupid alarm clock, useless and unbearably annoying to look at. I expected it to sound off at some point, but like the clock, it failed to deliver. It was raining outside. Clouds filled the sky in normal Lakewood fashion. I wasn't going to skate to school this time out of fear it would rust my skates and hinder my ability to skate fast, if even at all. Instead, I decided to ride the bus, pretending for only moments I really had a choice. As I climbed the bus steps, Davis rang out, "Hallelujah! James is here to save everyone from the evil clouds." I genuinely smiled for the first time that morning thanks to him. As usual, I sat next to the window seat that Davis courteously offered me. The beginning of history class was the same old story. As usual, I barely paid attention. I just thought about Abby and hoped she was okay. Interrupting my thoughts of Abby came a very rude outburst by Jason. It was odd to hear his voice, as I wasn't supposed to see him till art class. He stood outside our closed door waving his hands in hopes of disrupting us. It was clearly for no real reason, more meaningful than a toddler would have in invoking chaos around their immediate environment. Some people just want to get an emotional reaction to their behavior so they can feel a sense of power or control. Jason began banging on the door, so Mr. Hanson walked over and opened the door and asked, "Why aren't you in your class?" Jason responded saying, "Got kicked out. What's up?" "Go stand outside your class till it's over," Mr. Hanson commanded Jason. Jason rebelliously replied, "Don't tell me what to do, fatty." I could see Mr. Hanson was about to lose it, so I interrupted. "No one wants you here, Jason." Mr. Hanson looked back at me with a look of surprise. He seemed shocked I would say anything on his behalf. Jason became extremely silent, now refusing to look anywhere but at me. His glare was intense, but it seemed so forced. Like he wasn't really offended, but he didn't want to look weak in front of everyone else. Mr. Hanson then closed the door inches away from Jason's nose, but that didn't stop him from staring intensely through the vertical slot in the window. He remained so still and consistent in his stare. It was almost if he had become a red-faced, cartoonish portrait hanging on the door. As class came closer to an end, Jason was no longer staring at me and wasn't even visible from my perspective. Knowing Jason had something to prove, many of the students naturally assumed he was somewhere within the immediate vicinity. I could tell most everyone was concerned as they kept looking back at me, wondering what I was going to do about the clearly unstable and enraged jock that no doubt was still lurking just outside our door. Every kid in there knew I just couldn't hide out in the class. I was sure this was some kind of victory for Mr. Hanson. He knew I wouldn't have this immediate problem had I accepted his offer to be his teacher's assistant. My decisions led me to this. I built a doorway to certain destruction, and I knew if I was going to be brave, I had to walk through it. I didn't have the time to deal with hesitating class once. I didn't have the time to deal with hesitating once class was over. Seeing Abby was my real priority. I walked out with the class just like I normally did, only this time Jason was following close behind. As most everyone assumed he would, I was about to leave the main building to head over to the art trailer, only to feel a hand grab my shoulder. The hand slipped as I pulled away, nails scraping along my skin to clamp my shirt. I was then yanked swiftly back from the main hall door. It began. I yanked my shirt aggressively out of his hand and clutched my now scratched up shoulder. I was now facing Jason, who immediately lunged at me and threw me into the already half-broken door just behind me. I bounced back from the impact and pushed Jason in the center of his chest to distance him from me so I could continue walking away. Without hesitation, he used my response to further justify violence and began throwing punches. I was knocked to the ground within seconds, and he began trying to pull off my backpack, resulting in me being briefly dragged across the floor like a helpless child. I was now a couple yards away from the door I was trying to leave through. I twisted away to return to a standing position while simultaneously snatching my backpack so hard that it flew out of my hands and smacked the door behind me, leaving a huge crack in the glass. I could hear glass falling off the door behind me. People began to gather around us, and like a chemical reaction, they began screaming just as they did before. Meanwhile, much of what was happening was a blur, but I remember they would scream every time Jason hit me. Throughout the irrefutably one-way fight, it quickly got to the point where I didn't even feel the punches. I could only hear them laughing and yelling as Jason swung over and over again. I kept falling over and over, but every time I would return to stand tall, only to fail at defending myself from further blows. I didn't block a single hit. I didn't even throw one punch at him. As my nose began to bleed, one of the boys my sister was friends with, Matthew, grabbed me and pulled me out of the fight. He was twice my size, but also on Jason's football team, so naturally he did nothing to help me win. The only thing he offered me was an end to the beating I was suffering. Shortly after the fight ended, I found myself sitting on a mattress in the nurse's office, not allowed to leave, not allowed to do anything, but think about what happened. Despite everything in my head feeling scrambled and disorganized, there was Abby, waiting in the same place, just as she sat in the back of class. She radiated warmly in the back of my mind. As lunch approached, Principal Lehman came into the room I was staying at in the nurse's office and asked me how I was feeling. I responded, "Well, my tooth is chipped, my chin hurts, my face is bruised, and I just got humiliated in front of my peers." Mr. Lehman said, "I've gotten multiple statements saying you pushed him. What is your response?" I replied, "I pushed him back after he pushed me first. All I did was push him back once, and then he did this to my face." I made a circular motion around my face, showing how one-sided the fight was. Principal Lehman said in a commanding voice, "Well, he's suspended for 10 days. He paused and I felt relief, assuming the principal was on my side, but then he continued, "You will be suspended for 2 days.
I was surprised they would suspend someone for just pushing back when they are pushed. What was I supposed to do? Just ignore being assaulted? If school is meant to teach us how to survive in the real world, and in the real world you are legally allowed to defend yourself, how could they justify this punishment? Outrage. Principal Lehman informed me I could finish up the day and not return for the following 2 days.
You should at least be grateful for that. Jason was escorted off school grounds entirely, he said.
Principal Lehman stared at me sitting there, helpless and about to break down.
Okay then. See you in a few days,
he said, and quickly walked out. All I could focus on in that moment was the tacky ice pack on my face and the sinking feeling of worthlessness. It's not something I like to admit, but the truth is, I cried seconds after Principal Lehman left the room. The type of cry you suppress, but your eyes still become red. Your body trembles and painfully hot tears still fall. It was the type of sadness that made a person ache to their core, but you do your best to hold on. To not lose yourself to your emotions like you would so carelessly do as a child. I sat in the room alone till I could collect myself. Shortly after, I gathered my stuff and proceeded to finishing my classes for the day. I also asked a couple of my teachers about any work I would miss, so I could keep up while I was suspended. But I didn't have the motivation to stop by every single class before leaving the school. I was about to get on the bus home. I looked over to see Abby again in the parking lot with her boyfriend Seth. They were standing by his car. This time they were not showing affection. In fact, she seemed like she wasn't even willing to look at him, despite him clearly and aggressively speaking to her. Without a second's thought, I shifted away from the bus and began walking over to Abby to see if she was okay. The more I could hear Seth's tone as I approached, the more worried I became. She reacted to me like a guard dog in a ghetto fence yard once he realized I was headed towards him. He puffed out his shoulders and glared at me in attempts to look intimidating. Abby remained upset. It seemed like she was emotionally unable to look anywhere but the ground. Now within a fair speaking range, I tried to sound optimistic for the sake of Abby's emotional state.
Hey, Abby, were you at art class today?
I asked. Her boyfriend stepped in front of her to block my view and said,
Are you the kid that called the other night?
I responded.
Yeah, where? Just ignore him, James,
Abby mumbled loudly behind Seth. Seth looked back as if an arrow had just been plunged into his chest. Abby then walked around him looking only at me and said,
Will you walk me?
But paused when she saw my face. Abby's facial expression changed quickly to shock as she asked in an alarmed tone,
What happened?
Her boyfriend busted out laughing.
Oh, you didn't see this idiot get wrecked by Jason? He didn't even fight back. I would have had that jock prick choking in his own blood in seconds, but you just took a beating like a bitch.
Abby interrupted, screaming,
Shut up, Seth, you sadistic fake.
Seth's grin turned into a scowl. He rapidly stepped forward towards her, so I blocked his path by stepping in front of him. Seth looked more mortified than I had ever seen a person get. In such a short time knowing him, I could see he had a number of emotional issues, more than I could understand. Seth didn't try to get past Abby. He let his voice reach her with his screams.
You have no respect! After what I've done for you?
Abby replied,
I'm sick of this, Seth. I want nothing to do with you.
Her voice cracked as Seth screamed once more.
If you're ending this again,
He didn't know what to say, but in his eyes I could see a deep, intense hatred. When I looked in most people's eyes, I saw all kinds of things, but in him there was only anger and pain. His hands were shaking fiercely, his breathing noticeably irregular. He was losing it. Abby still refused to look at Seth as he threw his tantrum. He yelled,
Fine! Be with a guy who can't even protect himself, you idiot!
Seth got into his car and Abby tightly grabbed my arm. Her eyes remained closed like she was scared. Hiding in a shell, she jumped at the sound of Seth slamming his car door. Recklessly, Seth floored the gas pedal and his car lurched forward, barely missing Abby and me as he pulled out of the parking lot. Abby stood by silently with her eyes still closed. I didn't know how to act in a situation like this. Trying not to make it worse, I just said,
I will walk you home, just to answer your question.
Abby opened her eyes, but remained silent. She nodded. We had been walking for a while, every step making us feel like we were slightly away from our problems. She finally spoke.
So I was in art class, and I saw your cut-up bear.
I responded.
Yeah? Creepy, right? Maybe it was a foobar idea.
She laughed a little.
Yeah, I guess we're both kind of weird. I was all game for it.
I softly laughed as I began to feel raindrops hitting my arms and neck. I hear running. It's just as bad as walking in the rain, I said.
You get just as wet? She replied.
Yeah, it's something like that. It's like the harder you try to fix some problems, the worse they get. I impulsively asked to confirm what I had seen earlier.
So, your Seth is, she interrupted, hopefully soon completely out of my life.
My curiosity overtook me. I asked,
what happened?
She frowned and said,
other than what happened in the parking lot?
I responded,
well, I mean, I don't know. Don't say anything if you don't want to.
She stared at her feet as we continued to walk. I noticed her makeup was running. Shortly after, she noticed too and began to rush us getting home. Walking faster, she said,
I'm sorry. I really don't want you to see me like this.
She continued to rush slightly ahead of me. I stopped walking and said,
hey!
She slowed down and stopped, still facing away from me. We stood in the rain for only a few seconds before she asked,
do you think makeup really helps anyone?
I replied, still looking at her back.
I think it helps us forget what we don't want to remember. It lets us pretend we're a little more perfect than we really are.
She laughed sadly and said,
that's one way to put it.
I smiled and replied,
makeup is just makeup and skin is just skin. It is what it is.
Abby looked up at the rain for a moment and then down at the ground again. She then turned around with her rain-soaked face revealing what she was hiding under her makeup. Standing before her in the rain, looking at the results of what she had suffered, it broke my heart. Abby wasn't worried about her makeup running for the reason I thought. She was just afraid I would think when I saw the bruises on her face. Some of them were just like mine.
Do you see them?
She asked with a quiver in her voice. Without restraint, I responded with the first thing that came to my mind.
I see a beautiful girl who I very much enjoy walking with in the rain.
Despite her face being covered in falling drops of water, I could clearly see tears fall from her eyes. Her head fell forward as she began to shake, her tears falling almost in sync with the rain. I walked up to her and put my arm around her side, and I walked with her the rest of the way home. As we got to her doorstep, I said,
I'm just 7 letters away. Call if you need anything, okay?
She smiled and nodded.
See you tomorrow? She asked.
I replied,
I got suspended for 2 days.
She looked offended.
Whoa! Punishing the guy who just got beat up? Real classy.
I responded.
Yeah, well, I pushed him back.
She replied,
clearly not hard enough.
I laughed sadly, looking down as she unexpectedly wrapped her arms around me. Despite it being so cold and her being soaked, it was the warmest hug I had ever received. I hugged her back, said goodbye, and walked home with a huge smile on my face, bruises and all.
This is Doctorpiece Theatre, and my name is Dr. Business. As always, my friends,